The most powerful thing you will ever do is walk away without saying a word. Not in anger. Not in defeat. Not because you lost. But because you finally understood something that took the Stoics centuries to teach and most people a lifetime to learn. That the moment you stop explaining yourself to people who are never going to understand you anyway, the moment you stop fighting for a place that was slowly draining everything out of you, the moment you close the door quietly instead of dramatically, that is the moment your real life begins. Most people let go loudly. They make speeches. They send the final message. They need the other person to know, to understand exactly how much they were wrong, exactly why they are leaving, exactly what they are losing. They need closure from the outside because they have not yet learned to create it on the inside. But there is another way. A quieter way. A way so composed, so grounded, so absolutely certain of itself that it requires no audience, no validation, no final word. The Stoics called it the practice of releasing what is not yours to carry. Of closing chapters with your dignity fully intact. Of starting over not as someone who failed and escaped, but as someone who chose themselves so completely that nothing outside of them could hold them anymore. This is how you take your power back. Not with noise, with silence. And a new beginning that the old version of your life never could have given you. Point 1. Letting go is not weakness, it is the highest form of strength a human being can practice. Everything the modern world tells you about strength is wrong. It tells you that strength means holding on. That commitment means staying regardless of the cost. That walking away is giving up. That the person who endures the most, who tolerates the most, who stays the longest in the hardest situation, that person is the strong one. The Stoics looked at this idea and dismantled it completely. Strength, in the Stoic understanding, is not the capacity to endure anything. It is the wisdom to know what is worth enduring and what is slowly destroying the person you were built to be. It is the courage, and it takes enormous courage to release what no longer serves your growth, your peace, your purpose, even when the world around you is telling you that releasing it means you failed. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this with characteristic precision, Never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect. Never let go of anything. But never hold on to anything that costs you your self-respect in the holding. Because a person who has lost their self-respect has nothing. Not really. Let me tell you about a man named Chukwuemeka. Chukwuemeka had spent 11 years in a business partnership that had once been the best decision of his life. In the early years, it was genuine, two men building something together, trusting each other, growing. But over time, slowly and then all at once, the partnership became something else. His partner had become someone who took credit without sharing it, who made decisions that benefited himself at the expense of the business, who had quietly, over years, rearranged the entire structure of what they had built to favor himself. Chukwuemeka stayed. Because he had invested 11 years. Because they had history. Because leaving felt like admitting that 11 years had been wasted. Because people in the industry knew them as a pair, and he was afraid of what leaving would say about him. He stayed until he could barely recognize himself in the mirror. He had become quiet in ways that were not peace, they were suppression. He had become agreeable in ways that were not wisdom, they were defeat. The day he finally left, he said nothing dramatic. He did not make accusations. He did not send a letter cataloging every wrong. He sat across from his partner, said clearly and calmly that he was choosing a different direction, shook his hand, and walked out. People in the industry expected a public collapse. What they got instead was a man who, within 2 years, had built something new that was better in every measurable way. Not despite the leaving. Because of it. The 11 years were not wasted. They were the training ground. The leaving was not failure. It was the moment Chukwuemeka chose himself over the story he had been afraid to change. That is what Stoic strength looks like. Not the gritted teeth of someone enduring the intolerable. The open hands of someone who has understood that some things need to be released in order to become who you were always meant to be. Point 2. Silence is the most dignified exit. Why the final word is never as powerful as the last image you leave. There is a war inside every person who is leaving something or someone. And the war is always about the same thing. Do I say it or do I stay quiet? Do I tell them exactly what they did? Do I make them understand the full weight of what they cost me? Do I get the last word, the real last word, the one that finally makes them see what I see? The Stoics have an answer. And it is the one that is hardest to accept. No. Not because the truth isn't worth speaking. Not because you don't deserve to be understood. But because the final speech, the one people deliver when they are leaving, almost never achieves what they hope it will achieve. The person on the receiving end is not suddenly illuminated. They do not transform in front of your eyes. They defend, deflect, or dismiss. And you walk away having spent your last moments in that chapter in conflict rather than in clarity. Seneca wrote, "True happiness is to enjoy the present, without anxious dependence upon the future, not to amuse ourselves with either hopes or fears but to rest satisfied with what we have, which is sufficient." The final speech is a form of anxious dependence on the future, the hope that if you say exactly the right thing, they will finally give you the closure you have been waiting for. The Stoic truth is that closure is never given. It is only ever built, inside yourself, by yourself, on your own terms. Here is the story. There was a woman named Chidinma who had been in a friendship of 12 years with someone who, she had come to understand, had never fully respected her. The friendship was full of small but consistent patterns. The friend who always needed to be right, who always needed to be the more successful one, who took Chidinma's ideas and presented them as her own, who was only warm when Chidinma was visibly struggling and slightly cold when Chidinma was thriving. For 3 years before she left, Chidinma had been rehearsing the conversation she would have when she finally said enough. She had crafted it, refined it, imagined the friend's face as she heard every carefully chosen word. She was going to make her understand. She was going to finally say all the things she had swallowed for 12 years. And then one morning, she woke up and understood something with a clarity that surprised her. She did not owe that conversation to anyone. The speech she had been rehearsing was not for her friend, it was for herself. And the self it served was the part of her that was still hoping the friend would change, would see, would offer an apology that would finally make the 12 years make sense. That friend was never going to do any of those things. So Chidinma stopped returning calls. Gently at first, then with more distance. No dramatic announcement. No closing speech. Just the quiet withdrawal of her presence and her energy from a place that had never truly valued them. The friend noticed. She reached out. Chidinma responded briefly and kindly and without detail. Eventually, the friendship simply dissolved, not with a bang, not with a scene, but with a silence that said everything that needed to be said without giving anyone anything to argue against. Years later, Chidinma said the thing that surprised her most was how complete she felt about it. She had expected to feel unfinished. Instead, she felt sovereign. Like someone who had made a decision for themselves and executed it without requiring anyone else's permission or understanding. Your silence is not an absence. It is a statement. The most composed, most dignified, most powerful statement a person can make about where they are going and who they are choosing to become. Leave quietly. Let your life be the speech. Point 3. Release the story you've been telling about what happened, because the story is keeping you prisoner. Here is the thing nobody tells you about the things that hurt you. The event ends. The relationship ends. The loss happens. The betrayal occurs. And then the actual thing is over. But the story about the thing? The story can run for years. The replaying of conversations. The re-examination of decisions. The construction of the alternate timeline where you did it differently. Where you said the smarter thing. Where you caught it before it happened. The story that runs on a loop in the quiet moments, in the car, in the space between sleep and waking. That story which is not the event but your mind's narrative about the event is where most people actually live when they have been hurt. The Stoics called this fantasia the impression, the mental image, the story the mind creates about what has happened. And they understood that the impression is not the same as reality. What actually happened is fixed. It is over. But the impression, the story, is entirely in your control. You can examine it, question it, revise it, or most powerfully release it. Epictetus taught, "Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things." Not the event. The opinion about the event. The story. The meaning you have attached to it. Change the story, not to deny the pain, but to stop letting a narrative you constructed be the thing that runs your life. Let me tell you about a man named Adise. Adise, a woman, despite the name her family had chosen, had been passed over for a promotion she had earned every qualification for. A less experienced colleague received it instead, and the reasons given were vague and institutional and unconvincing. She knew what had happened. She felt it in her body. And she was right. But Adise spent the next 2 years living inside the story of what had happened more than she lived inside her actual life. She talked about it constantly to friends, to family, to herself in the mirror at 6 in the morning. She replayed every performance review, every interaction with the decision makers, every meeting where she had been brilliant and had somehow still not been seen. The story was real. The injustice was real. And the story was also slowly eating her alive. A mentor finally said something that landed. "You were wronged. That is true. And the person who is wronging you now is you by keeping yourself in that room, replaying that decision, while your actual life is happening somewhere else." Adise did not need to forgive the institution. She did not need to pretend the injustice hadn't happened. What she needed to do, what the Stoics would have advised, was release the story's grip on her present. To say, "This happened. I did not deserve it. I am not going to let it define every day that comes after it." She left the company. She started over somewhere new. And she carried with her not bitterness but something the Stoics would have recognized. The hard-won wisdom of someone who had been tested, who had been found to be more than what was done to them, and who had decided clearly and finally that the story of the wrong was not the most interesting story she had to live. Release the story? Not to protect the people who wrote it. To free yourself from the prison of living in it. Point 4. Starting over is not starting from zero. Everything you've lived is still with you. Here is the lie that stops people from starting over. The lie says, if you leave, you lose everything. All the years, the effort, the investment, the identity, it disappears. Starting over means going back to the beginning, to nothing, to zero. And who wants to do that? Who wants to stand at the bottom of another mountain when they have already climbed so far up this one? This is not true. And the Stoics understood precisely why it is not true. Everything you have done, every difficulty you have survived, every skill you have built, every lesson you have learned from every mistake you have made, none of that leaves with the thing you are releasing. It lives in you. It has become you. The company may close, but the businessman who built it carries every skill forward. The relationship may end, but the person who loved in it carries the capacity, the depth, the understanding of themselves that only that experience could have produced. Marcus Aurelius lost campaigns he had planned carefully. He lost people he loved. He lost years to illness and to the obligations of rule that kept him from the philosophical life he genuinely preferred. And he never described any of it as starting from zero. He described it as the accumulation of material. Asterisk. The obstacle is the way. Asterisk. Everything that happened was data. Everything that happened made him more of what he needed to be for what came next. Here is the story. There was a woman named Blessing who had spent 8 years building a restaurant. Everything she had, her savings, her parents' loans, her 20s, the best years of her energy and creativity went into that restaurant. And then, through a combination of rising costs, a changing neighborhood, and one catastrophic year of compounding problems, the restaurant closed. People who knew her expected devastation. Some of it came. She grieved. She sat with the loss honestly, because the Stoics never taught that you should pretend not to feel things. Only that you should not be ruled by what you feel. And then she looked at what she actually had. 8 years of understanding what customers wanted before they could articulate it. 8 years of supply chain knowledge, of managing people under pressure, of solving problems that had no textbook solutions. 8 years of learning what worked and, more valuable, what didn't. 8 years of relationships with suppliers, staff, and regulars who trusted her completely. She had not lost 8 years. She had become 8 years. She had been built by them. Within 3 years, she opened something new. Smaller. Smarter. Built with the wisdom that only failing at something honestly can give you. And it thrived in the way that the first restaurant, begun without that wisdom, never could have. She told a journalist. People kept saying I was starting over. But I was not starting over. I was starting better. There is no version of what I built the second time that exists without everything the first time taught me. When you let go and start again, you do not go back to zero. You go forward, carrying everything you are, everything you have learned, everything failure and loss and time have built inside you. The only thing you leave behind is what no longer fits. That is not starting over. That is arriving. Point 5. Stop explaining yourself to people who are never going to understand. The Stoic practice of inner authority. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that belongs only to people who have been trying, for months, or years, or sometimes a lifetime, to make someone understand them who has decided not to. Not someone who cannot understand. Someone who has decided not to. And yet the effort continues. The explanations get longer, more detailed, more carefully structured. The evidence mounts. The conversations circle the same ground again and again, each time slightly differently worded, in the hope that this time, the framing will be the one that finally lands. It never lands. And the person doing the explaining slowly loses something they may not even have a name for, their inner authority. Their sense that their reality is valid whether or not it is confirmed by the person across from them. Their ability to know what they know without needing another person's recognition of it to make it real. The Stoics called this hegemonic in the governing faculty, the ruling part of the self. The part that knows. That sees clearly. That does not require outside validation to trust its own perceptions. Epictetus was emphatic about this. He said the person who needs others to agree with them in order to feel confident in their own reality has given away their most important possession. And the path back to themselves runs directly through the practice of releasing the need to be understood by people who are not trying to understand them. Here is the story. There was a man named Alyawasian who had spent 3 years in a difficult family dynamic. A parent who consistently reframed events in ways that made Alyawasian doubt his own memory and perception. Every conversation about the relationship ended with Alyawasian feeling confused, guilty, and somehow responsible for things he had not done. Every attempt to explain how he experienced the dynamic was met with an alternative version of reality so confidently presented that he began to question his own. He went to a therapist. The therapist listened to several months of these described conversations, and said something simple that changed everything. You keep trying to get him to confirm your reality. What if your reality doesn't need his confirmation? Alyawasian sat with that for a long time. He realized the explaining was not really for his parent who was never going to agree. The explaining was for himself. He was trying to use his parents' agreement as proof that what he experienced was real. And as long as that proof was withheld, he kept going back. Kept trying. Kept making the case. He stopped making the case. Not in anger. Not dramatically. He simply, gradually, with enormous effort, stopped needing the verdict. He knew what had happened. He knew how it had felt. He knew what he needed. And he began to build his life around that knowing, without waiting for it to be ratified. The freedom was not immediate. But it was real. And it grew, every week that he lived from his own inner authority rather than reaching outside himself for permission to trust his own perception. Stop explaining yourself to people who are not trying to understand you. Your reality does not require their agreement to be real. Know what you know. And let the knowing be enough. Point 6. Grieve the loss honestly. You cannot truly let go of what you have never truly mourned. Here is where the Stoic path diverges most sharply from what most people expect. People expect the Stoics to say, feel nothing. Move on immediately. Suppress the grief, the loss, the pain. Be strong, which means be emotionless. Detach and proceed. That is not what the Stoics said. That is not what the Stoics practiced. And it is not what actually works. The Stoics understood with remarkable psychological precision for their time that grief is not weakness. It is the appropriate and necessary response of a human being to the loss of something real. Attempting to suppress it or deny it does not eliminate it. It only drives it underground, where it does its damage in the dark rather than in the open. What the Stoics taught was not the absence of grief but the quality of grief. Grieve the thing honestly. Sit with the loss fully. Do not perform tragedy for an audience, and do not perform strength for one either. Simply in private, in real terms, let yourself feel the weight of what has ended. And then, having felt it fully and honestly, choose what comes next. Marcus Aurelius grieved. He lost children. He lost his closest advisor and friend, Fronto. He wrote about loss with a tenderness that contradicts every caricature of Stoic coldness. He grieved, and then he returned to his work, his philosophy, his duty. Not because the grief was gone, but because he had met it fully and it had not destroyed him. Here is the story. There was a woman named Zara who ended a 6-year relationship. A relationship that needed to end, that she knew needed to end, and that she had finally found the clarity and the courage to end. And then she did not let herself be sad about it. She had decided, consciously, that because the relationship needed to end, because it was the right decision, because she had been the one to make it, she was not entitled to grief. She threw herself into work, into new plans, into reinvention. She talked to everyone about the exciting next chapter and did not give herself a single afternoon to sit with the loss of a person she had loved deeply for 6 years. For 8 months this worked. On the surface. Then, without warning or obvious cause, she collapsed not physically but emotionally. Everything she had not let herself feel arrived all at once. The grief, the sadness, the missing of a person even while knowing the relationship was wrong, the mourning of a future she had once believed in and had now released it came without warning in the middle of an ordinary Wednesday and was completely overwhelming. She finally sat with it. She cried for days in a way she had not allowed herself to do in 8 months. And when it passed, when she had actually moved through it rather than around it, she found on the other side a lightness she had not expected. Real release. The kind that only comes from having genuinely felt what you are releasing. Grieve honestly. Not forever. Not as a performance. But as the real, human acknowledgement that something that mattered has ended. That is not weakness. That is the Stoic completion of loss, the full cycle that makes genuine starting over possible. You cannot truly begin a new chapter if you have not read the last page of the old one. Feel it. Then close the book. Point 7. Cut contact with your former self. The person you were is not the person you are becoming. There is a less obvious thing that needs to be released when you let go of a situation, a relationship, or a chapter of your life. Not just the external thing. The internal version of yourself that was built inside that situation. The identity that formed around it. The beliefs about yourself that were shaped by it. The limitations you absorbed from it and began to call your own. Every significant relationship, every long chapter of life, every environment we inhabit for a period of time, they shape us. They tell us things about ourselves. Some of those things are true and useful and worth keeping. Others are the stories that specific situations needed us to believe in order to maintain the dynamic. And when the situation ends, those stories need to end too. The Stoics were deeply attentive to this. They understood that the self is not fixed. That we are constantly shaped by what we give our time and attention to, which means we can also choose to be shaped by something different. To decide deliberately that the identity built in the old chapter does not need to travel into the new one. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, began his philosophical life as a merchant. When his ship sank and he lost everything, he wandered into a bookshop in Athens and began reading Socrates. Something in him recognized that the merchant's identity, which circumstance had now removed, was not the only identity available to him. He had the freedom to become something entirely different. He became the founder of one of the most enduring philosophical traditions the world has ever produced. Not despite losing his merchant identity. Because of it. Here is the story. There was a man named Emeka who had spent 15 years in a marriage that for most of those 15 years had quietly communicated to him that he was not enough. Not cruel communication. Not dramatic. Just the persistent, ambient message of a relationship where he was consistently the one apologizing, consistently the one adjusting, consistently the one made to feel that his instincts, desires, and ways of being in the world were slightly wrong. He absorbed it. Over 15 years, he absorbed it so completely that he stopped being able to distinguish between what he actually thought and felt and wanted, and what the relationship had trained him to think and feel and want. When the marriage ended, he expected to feel free. Instead, he felt lost. Because the person he had built inside the marriage, the self-doubting, constantly adjusting, seeking permission version of himself, was the only self he could clearly locate. He began working with a therapist and reading philosophy. And slowly, very slowly, he began the process of identifying the beliefs he had absorbed that were not his own. I am too much. Not his belief, it was handed to him. My instincts are usually wrong. Not his belief, it was repeated to him until he forgot it was someone else's opinion. I need to earn the right to take up space. Not his belief, but 15 years of a certain dynamic had made it feel like truth. He released these one by one. Not all at once. But deliberately, over time, he let the old self dissolve, not because that self was worthless, but because it had been built inside a specific situation that no longer existed. What emerged was someone who surprised him. Someone quieter in some ways, louder in others. Someone with preferences he had forgotten he had. Someone who took up space without apology. Someone his friends said seemed finally like himself. You are allowed to leave behind the version of yourself that was built inside the thing you are releasing. That version served a purpose. It kept you functional inside a specific context. But the context is ending. And you are permitted, encouraged, in fact, to let the self that was built for it dissolve along with it. Step into the new chapter as someone who is still being made. That is not instability. That is the highest form of Stoic self-cultivation, the willingness to be continuously rebuilt by experience, always in the direction of who you actually are. Point 8. Do not announce your new beginning, let it speak for itself. One of the most consistent mistakes people make when they are starting over is the announcement. The social media post about the new chapter. The conversation where they tell everyone about the changes they are making. The declaration, sometimes inspiring, sometimes performing, about who they are becoming and what they are leaving behind. The Stoics were deeply skeptical of this impulse. Not because sharing is wrong, but because the announcement, the public declaration of the transformation, almost always precedes the actual transformation rather than following from it. And in preceding it, it often replaces it. There is psychological research that confirms what the Stoics intuited. When we tell people about our intentions, the brain experiences a premature sense of completion. The telling feels like the doing. The declaration gives us the social reward, the attention, the support, the recognition that we were supposed to be working toward. And having received it early, we have less energy and less motivation for the actual work of becoming. Marcus Aurelius never announced his meditations. He never published them. He wrote them for himself, in private, and they were found after his death. The most famous personal development journal in human history was never meant to be seen, because it was not for anyone else. It was the actual work, not the performance of the work. Epictetus said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." Do not perform your growth for the crowd. Do the growth in private, in silence, in the unglamorous work of daily discipline. And let the evidence of the change eventually be so undeniable that it speaks for itself. Here is the story. There was a woman named Fatu who had left a difficult situation, a toxic workplace, with enormous energy and enormous plans. She told everyone. Her social media became a record of the new chapter, the new morning routines, the new goals, the new reading, the new version of herself that was emerging from the difficulty she had survived. For the first 3 months, the response was wonderful. People liked her posts, sent messages of support, told her she was inspiring. And Fatu, who had been genuinely struggling inside the workplace situation, felt for the first time in a long time like she was being seen and valued. Then the energy ran out. The posts slowed. The routines she had announced became harder to maintain without the audience to perform them for. The new chapter, which had been so publicly declared, had somehow never fully begun because the performance of it had been mistaken for the thing itself. She talked to an older woman she respected, someone who had rebuilt her own life twice and done it quietly. The woman listened and then said, "Stop talking about who you are becoming. Become her. Then, when you have become her, you will not need to announce it. Everyone will already know." The two went quiet. She deleted the posts about the new chapter. She stopped telling people what she was working on. She just worked. Every morning, with no audience. Every week, without checking whether anyone was watching. A year later, she was entirely different. Not in the ways she had announced. The announced version had been a performance of transformation rather than the real thing. In quieter, deeper ways. Ways that people who knew her noticed before she said a word about it. Do your transformation in private. Work in the silence. Let the evidence accumulate. And when the time comes when people ask what changed, you can tell them. But the telling will be the end of the story, not the beginning of it. Point 9. The Stoic art of beginning again with nothing to prove. Here is the thing that makes starting over feel most threatening. Not the practical difficulty. Not the uncertainty. Not the fear of failure. The ego. The part of you that says, "I was someone. I had built something. I had a reputation, a position, a place in the hierarchy of things. And now I am beginning again, which means I am, by some social measure, behind. Which means people who know where I was will see where I am now and draw conclusions about what happened in between." The Stoics had a direct prescription for this particular form of suffering. Release the attachment to what other people think your trajectory should look like. Because the person who begins again with nothing to prove, who genuinely does not need the new chapter to vindicate the old one, is the freest person in the room. They are not managing optics. They are not making decisions based on how they will look. They are not holding themselves back from the right move because the right move seems like a step backward and stepping backward seems like admitting defeat. They are just building. Honestly. From where they actually are rather than from where they wish they appeared to be. Seneca wrote, "It is not because things are difficult that we do not dare. It is because we do not dare that they are difficult." The biggest obstacle to beginning again is almost never practical. It is the unwillingness to be seen in the early stages, to be a beginner again, to not know things, to be imperfect in public, to have a story that includes a fall before it includes a rise. Here is the story. There was a man named Ikechukwu who had been, for 10 years, at the top of his industry. A senior executive. Known. Respected. Sought after. His name on reports that people read. His opinion in rooms that mattered. A restructuring removed the position. Not his choice. Not his failure. Just the indifferent mechanism of corporate change, which cares nothing for the decade of excellence preceding it. He was offered a position 2 levels below what he had held. By any traditional measure of career trajectory, it was a step backward. The optics were clear. People would see. People would talk. He took the position. Not because he had no other choice, he had other choices. He took it because the work genuinely interested him, because the company had values he respected, and because the Stoic logic was simple. If the work is right and the life it builds is right, the level on the organizational chart is a preferred indifferent. Fine to care about in the abstract. Not worth compromising the actual living of your life. He showed up on his first day in the new role with the same quality of attention, the same depth of thinking, the same commitment to doing excellent work that he had brought to the senior position. Without the senior title. Without the recognition that came with it. Without any visible anxiety about the gap between where he had been and where he was. Within 18 months, he had been promoted twice. Not because he was performing his lack of ego. Because when you genuinely release the need to prove something, you free up enormous amounts of energy that had been going toward the performance. And that energy goes straight back into the actual work. Begin again with nothing to prove. The freedom of that is not a consolation prize. It is the most powerful position available to a human being, the one with nothing to protect and everything to build. Point 10. Silence is the sound of someone who has already decided, and that decision is everything. We come back, finally, to where we began. Because everything we have traveled through, the releasing, the grieving, the letting go of old stories and old selves and the need for validation and the anxiety of appearances, it all arrives at the same place. A decision. Made quietly. With no audience. The Stoics understood that the most significant moments in a human life are almost never dramatic. They are internal. They are the moment private, unglamorous, often unremarkable in appearance when a person decides with their whole self that something is over. Or that something is beginning. Or that they are no longer willing to be what circumstances have made of them and are choosing, from this day forward, to become what they actually intend to be. No announcement. No ceremony. No one watching. Just the decision. And then the living of it. Zeno decided in a bookshop in Athens. His ship had sunk. He was reading about Socrates. And something clicked, not loudly, not dramatically, and a merchant became a philosopher. The decision happened in a moment. The living of it took the rest of his life. Marcus Aurelius decided every morning at his desk before the empire woke. The decision was to be a good man first and an emperor second, to govern from philosophy rather than from ego. That decision was made in silence, in private, in handwriting that was never meant to be read. And that decision shaped the most powerful position in the ancient world. Epictetus decided, in chains, in pain, in the complete absence of external freedom, that his mind belonged to no one who did not have his permission. That decision cost him nothing material, because he had nothing material. And it gave him something that his wealthy, powerful, free contemporaries would never have, the sovereignty of a self that could not be touched. Here is the final story. There was a woman, let's call her Ada, who had spent the better part of 4 years trying to decide. About a relationship that was hurting her. About a career that had stopped fitting who she had become. About a version of herself she had outgrown but kept wearing because it was familiar, and because changing felt like too much, and because what would people say, and what would she do on the other side, and what if she was wrong? 4 years of trying to decide. And then one morning, an ordinary morning, nothing special about it, no dramatic catalyst, no final straw, she simply decided. Not loudly. She did not tell anyone. She did not post about it. She did not call her closest friend to process it. She sat with her coffee in the early morning light and she felt, for the first time in 4 years, the specific and unmistakable sensation of clarity. Of having chosen. Of the choosing being done. She began that same day to make the small, practical moves that the decision required. Not rushing. Not performing. Just moving, steadily, quietly, with the calm certainty of someone who is no longer deciding. Within a year, the life she was living looked almost nothing like the life she had been living the morning of the decision. And she said that the strangest part was that no one who knew her casually would have been able to identify the exact moment when everything changed. There was no moment visible from the outside. There was only a woman who had decided, in silence, for herself, with no one watching, and then simply lived the decision, one day after another, until the life she had chosen and the life she was living were finally the same thing. That is how you take your power back. Not with noise. Not with a final speech or a dramatic exit or a public declaration. With a decision, quiet, total, completely your own, to let go of what is finished and begin, in silence, the only life that was ever really yours to live. Somewhere right now, there is a person holding on to something they know needs to be released. Maybe it is a relationship. Maybe it is a chapter of work. Maybe it is a version of themselves that no longer fits. Maybe it is a story about what happened to them that they have told so many times it has become more real than the actual life happening around it. And they are holding on because letting go feels like losing. Because starting over feels like admitting defeat. Because the silence on the other side of the decision feels emptier than the noise inside the thing they are in. The Stoics would sit with that person and say, "You are not afraid of what you are losing. You are afraid of who you will be without it. And who you will be without it is the only person who can live the rest of your life." Let go. In silence. Not because it is easy. Not because it will not hurt. But because the life that is waiting for you on the other side of that decision is not the consolation prize for the life you thought you were going to have. It is the real one. The most powerful thing you will ever do is walk away without saying a word. And then build quietly, deliberately, completely on your own terms something that silence alone could never have given you. If this reached something in you, share it with someone who needs permission to begin again.